Hey everybody, it's Dylan from ON1 here, and in this video, we're going to learn how to fix overexposed images using ON1 Photo RAW. ON1 Photo RAW is the all-in-one editing solution for your photography, combining the best of Lightroom and Photoshop into one single application. With raw processing, creative effects filters, masking, layers, and much more, ON1 Photo RAW can improve and speed up your editing while ensuring you're creating the images that you've been envisioning all along. Learn more about Photo RAW by heading over to our website at www.on1.com. In the meantime, let's learn how to fix overexposed images. Inside of Photo RAW, if we're looking to recover blown out highlights and fix overexposed photographs, one of the fastest, easiest ways to do it is to use the highlight slider inside of the Develop tab. So I'm going to head into this Develop tab here. I'm going to go into my Tone and Color pane, and I'm going to open up this Tone section. And in the Tone section, we have this Highlight slider. And we can use this slider to recover blown out highlights within our photographs. So before we use this Highlight slider, I just want to give a couple of tips on how you can identify blown out highlights, or highlight clipping as they call it, within your images. The fastest way to do it is just by holding down the J key on your keyboard. So it's just, again, the J key on your keyboard, and that's going to show you your clipping warnings. Essentially, in red, with a red overlay, this is showing us all of the true white without any detail, or our clipping warnings for our highlights. If you were to see blue, let me just pull back on this black slider here. If you were to see a blue overlay, that's going to show you your true black without any detail, essentially your shadow clipping warnings. So in this video, we're essentially worried more about that highlight clipping within our image with that red overlay. So again, holding down the J key, I can see that this area in my sky is blown out and it's completely white without any detail. So if I zoom into the sky area here, we can see we're losing a lot of that detail within our sky when we originally photographed it. So what we want to do here is we're just going to go over to our highlight slider, and we're just going to pull back on that highlight slider. You can see by pulling back on that highlight slider, we're recovering a lot of that highlight detail and bringing back that texture and contrast that was in those clouds when we photographed it. So if I hold down my J key now, I'm not seeing any clipping warnings for my highlights. But if I reset my highlight slider, you can see I have all of this area in red, again indicating that these are true white areas without any detail, and they are just essentially white within my photograph that has no contrast or detail within it. And so what we can do again is just pull back on our highlights slider there, and we can bring back and recover a lot of that cloud detail within our sky. So let me just reset that highlight slider again. This is back to 0. We're back to that true white without any detail. And then if we pull back on our highlight slider, we can recover a lot of that nice cloud detail and texture and bring back that sky that we were photographing out in the field. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're using the Develop tab here is that these adjustments with these sliders are going to be applied to the entirety of the photograph. And so if I were to reset this highlight slider here and then pull back on the highlight slider again, you can see it's modifying not only the sky area, but it's modifying this foreground section as well. And for some images, that may be fine. But some images, you may not want to modify this foreground section with highlight recovery. You may want to leave the highlights in the foreground as they were. In cases like that, this is where you'd want to bring in a local adjustment. With a local adjustment, you can use the same highlight slider, but you can use it selectively and mask it in where you want it to be applied to. So let's mask in a local adjustment highlight recovery into just the sky section so that we can avoid modifying our foreground. To do that, we're going to head into our local adjustments. We're going to add an adjustment. And with our local adjustment here, I'm just going to double click on my exposure slider because by default, it's automatically set to -1. And we're just going to pull back on the highlight slider to around 40 or so. I think that's where it was when we were modifying it in the Develop tab. And so there's a few different ways that you can apply this local adjustment highlight recovery to your sky section. The first way being just a masking brush. So with my masking brush here, which you can grab by just hitting B on your keyboard if it's not automatically selected for you, I'm going to make sure that I'm set to paint so that I can paint in this adjustment into the sky. I'm also going to make sure that my feathering is at 100 so that I have a nice soft brush edge. And I'm also going to ensure that my opacity is at 100 so that I'm painting in all of this adjustment into that sky area. So I'm just going to make my brush size a little bit larger there. And watch as I brush in my highlight recovery local adjustment. It's doing the same thing that it was doing earlier in bringing back that cloud detail within the sky, but now it's not modifying that foreground section. I've selectively applied it into that sky area and I've protected my foreground from the adjustment. So if I hold down my J key on my keyboard, looks like we missed just a little bit of a section there. I can just paint onto there. Or I can even actually lower my brush size. And I can paint that into that section there. May need to lower it a little bit more. But there we go. I can hold down the J key on my keyboard and I can turn this adjustment off and on. And with the adjustment, it's clearing up all of that true white without any detail and bringing back the cloud texture and contrast that was originally there when we photographed that sky. So this is without the adjustment applied, and this is with that local adjustment applied. Now, one pro tip I forgot to mention when I was brushing is that you can modify the brush size with the bracket keys on your keyboard. So essentially the right bracket key will increase the brush size and the left bracket key will decrease the brush size. And it's really helpful for situations that you saw there where you need to lower that brush size down quite a bit to fit into a particular area of your scene. Another way that you can mask in your local adjustment into your sky section or any region within your photograph is by using your masking bug, which is essentially your gradient mask tool that you can use to mask with gradients and shapes. So let me just reset this mask here. You can see it's not applying that highlight adjustment into the scene anymore. And what we can do is we can use our masking bug by hitting M on our keyboard. Or you can head up top here and it's this icon there that you can select to grab your masking bug. But a really handy way to grab it right out of the gate without moving your cursor anywhere is just by hitting M on the keyboard. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to drop this down and we're going to rotate it with this smaller handle here to apply that highlight recovery adjustment into our sky section. We can use this larger handle to position if we need to. I may rotate it just a little bit more there. And if I hold down the J key on my keyboard, you can see with that gradient there, it's doing a great job of modifying the sky section without applying that highlight recovery to my foreground. So if I turn this off and on now, the highlight recovery is applied to the top section of our photograph. And again, it's protecting that bottom foreground area. Another great way to selectively apply a highlight recovery into a specific area of your photograph is to use a luminosity mask. With luminosity masks, it's going to target bright and dark regions within your photograph so that you can effectively target that bright area in your sky while avoiding the other areas in your image. So let's open up the masking options again. I will reset the mask, and we're going to grab a luminosity mask. To enable a luminosity mask, all you have to do is head down to this bottom section of your masking properties, and it's this little light bulb. You can see it says Create Luminosity Mask. So we're just going to select that there. If I view this, remember in masking, white reveals and black conceals. By default, the white regions, or the brightest regions within our scene, are the ones that are targeted the most by our luminosity mask, while the shadow tones within our scene, especially in our foreground, are being protected from this luminosity mask. So if I view this photograph again and I turn this adjustment off and on, you can see it's doing a great job of only targeting the bright areas within the scene. And if I hold down the J key on my keyboard, again, it's effectively eliminating all of those bright highlights within the photograph. Now, sometimes when it comes to luminosity masks, you may not want it applied to specific areas in your scene. So if we view this, now even though it's not completely white down here on the road, it still is applying some of that local adjustment into the foreground section. So what we can do is we can use our masking bug to target just different sections of the image with our luminosity mask. So if we only want this applied into the top area of our scene, I'm just going to hit M on the keyboard to grab my masking bug again. I'm just going to drop this down, and then I'll flip this, or rotate it rather, and then pull this up. So you can see now that luminosity mask is only being applied into that sky section, and I don't have the luminosity mask applied into the bottom area of my scene. So if I turn this off and on, if I view the photograph and turn this off and on, that luminosity mask is only applied to that sky section, and it's not modifying or adjusting the foreground area within the photo. So again, we'll just hold down the J key, show those clipping warnings. You can see we have that true white without any detail in the clouds. And then if we turn this adjustment on, with that highlight recovery and our luminosity mask, it's strictly targeting those bright areas within our sky and avoiding all of the darker regions within our scene. And because we use that gradient, it's not even modifying that bottom section at all. So adjustment on, adjustment off. Another way you can recover overexposed areas within your photograph is by using exposure adjustments rather than highlight adjustments. So let me just eliminate this local adjustment here. And let's go into the Develop tab again. What we can do to recover the blown out areas within the sky here is we can head back into our tone section and we can lower down the exposure. Essentially, because we have an overexposed scene, we can decrease the exposure to recover those highlights. So in my tone section here, I'm just going to hold down the J key on my keyboard. Again, this is showing my clipping warnings with that true white without any detail, my highlight clippings. And I'm going to pull back on the exposure slider to bring back that detail and get rid of the true white within the clouds. Now, obviously, because I'm pulling back on the exposure, the image is really dark now, especially within our foreground area of the photo. So what we can do to combat the darkening of the entirety of the image is we can play with these other sliders. So we've modified our exposure a bit to remove those highlights. What we can do to avoid bringing back exposure into the highlights is we can modify our midtones and our shadow tones. So I'm going to hold down the J key on my keyboard to make sure I'm not bringing back any of that true white into the scene. And let's just pull up on our midtones. You can see, because I'm not pulling up on the exposure and I'm just pulling up on my midtone slider, I haven't brought back any of that true white without any detail into my sky. And yet I've brought back life into my foreground section of the photo. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you can see this is the original and this is after. And that's by removing the exposure within your tone section and then pulling back on the midtones or the shadow slider. Now, if we were dealing with a really dark foreground here, we could do the same thing with our shadows, or we could play around with the two to balance them out. So if I just pull back my midtones a bit to around 30 or so, I could bring back some of those darker shadow tones by pulling up on the shadow slider. And you can see again, it's not affecting that sky area at all because I'm modifying specific tonalities, the midtones and the shadows within the scene, and I'm not adjusting the exposure of the highlights. And again, if I check out the original, here's the original, and then with those three sliders adjusted. Now, one thing I would recommend doing, and it really depends on the image that you're adjusting, but if you are seeing a bit of flatness within the photograph, especially within your foreground or your sky area, it may actually help to bring back some whites into the scene. Now with this image here, I think if we pull up on the whites at all, it's going to bring back some of those clipping warnings there. So what we can do is we can remove the exposure a little bit more and then pull back some of the whites there, and it will give us a little bit more life and a little bit more contrast in those specific areas of the photo. Now again, with this image, the whites are really sensitive because we have quite a bit of blown out area within the sky. But depending on the image that you're modifying, I would recommend playing around with that white slider to again see if you can bring back a little bit of that life if the image is appearing dull or flat. Another thing I'd recommend playing around with is your camera profile. So for example, if I reset our tone and color adjustments and I pull back the exposure to remove the true white without any detail, and I bring back some midtones and I bring back some shadow tones, and the image is looking decent, but it needs just a little bit more life, head into your camera profile menu here, and you can play around with these camera profiles to see if you can't bring back a little bit more contrast and life into the image. The great thing about these camera profiles is that if I hold down the J key on my keyboard, it's not bringing back any of those highlights that I adjusted before. And so with Vivid here, it's a little bit too bright there, so we may not have to have all of those shadows or midtones exposed within the scene. And yet, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard with just 1, 2, 3, and then I guess we can call the camera profile a fourth adjustment. If I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, this is the original, and then we have after. So we've effectively brought back that detail within our clouds, we've brought back the life in our foreground, and we've increased the color a bit with that camera profile there. You could also modify the camera profile when you're just adjusting the highlights. So if I reset this, I'm just going to pull back on the highlights again, holding down my J key there. So I've gotten rid of those bright blown out highlights within my sky. Now let's bring back some life into the scene by again going into our camera profile and playing around with the look of it. So original and after with simply two modifiers applied. Our highlights and this camera profile. Now with the exposure adjustment, when I was modifying the exposure to decrease it and then brought back my midtones and shadows, you can do that same thing with your local adjustments. So if I go into my local adjustments here, we'll add an adjustment. And remember, by default, our local adjustments are set to -1. So let's pull that back just a little bit. I think we were around 1.5 stops in our Develop tab earlier. Let's bring back those midtones as we did before. Maybe a bit of the shadow tones there. And we can do the same sort of masking techniques that we did earlier with our highlight recovery in our local adjustments. We can use our masking brush. Just like that. So we have with the adjustment applied and with after, without the adjustment applied to it. We could also use our masking bug or our gradient mask tool by hitting M on the keyboard. We'll just drop this down. We'll rotate it there. If we hold down the J key, turn this adjustment off and on, you can see we're recovering all of that highlight detail in the sky with our exposure adjustment, but we're avoiding that bottom foreground section. And again, you can do it with a luminosity mask. So let me reset this mask here. We'll do the same thing. We'll grab a luminosity mask. You can see it's targeting that bright area in the sky there. But again, we don't want it applied to our foreground section. So we'll drop down our gradient mask. We can again just rotate it there to ensure that that luminosity mask is applied exactly where we want it to be. We'll just pull up on this. And that will ensure that that foreground area is completely protected from the adjustment and the luminosity mask. So if we turn this off and on here, it's doing a great job of bringing back that cloud detail that we lost when we photographed that sky. So with this image here, I think the local adjustment is doing a great job, especially with our luminosity mask applied to it. But one thing you may want to look out for are really harsh edges within the luminosity mask being applied as your adjustment. So for example, if we remove the exposure a little bit more, and we add contrast, sometimes we may end up with some harsher edges within that adjustment there. And so what we can do to combat that is if we go into our masking options, we can play with the feathering. So if we view the mask here, typically luminosity masks are going to have some harsher edges because they're going to identify the bright and dark areas. And with clouds, more often than not, we have some harsh edges within the edges of these clouds where that mask is being applied to. So what you can do is if you go into your masking options, if we pull up on the feathering slider, we can soften those edges up and it will blend that adjustment into the scene a bit better. So that's without any feathering, and this is with a bit more feathering applied to it. You can see it just appears a bit more natural there because, again, it's softening up those edges and blending that mask into those other areas nicely. And keep in mind, I lowered that exposure quite a bit there just to demonstrate it, so it may not look the best there. And all we have to do to fix that is just modify that exposure a little bit more. But again, that feathering can really help, especially when you're using luminosity masks, to blend that adjustment into the other areas of your photograph. So just to quickly recap, the fastest and easiest way to recover blown out highlights within your image is to go into the Develop tab, go into your tone and color pane, and modify this highlight slider. You can see it's doing a great job right out of the gate to get rid of that blown out area within our sky and bring back those details within the clouds there. Now you can also modify the exposure to bring back those highlights as well. I'm just going to hold down the J key. I can remove the exposure within my image. And then I can bring back some midtones and some shadow tones to bring life back into my foreground. Now again, you may want to play with the white slider a bit to give your image a little bit more contrast. Now keep in mind with this image, these areas are a bit sensitive to the white slider because they were pretty blown out, so we're probably not going to get much out of this white slider. But especially in the foreground, if we're not looking at the sky there, that white slider can really help to bring back life into those areas of your photo. Another thing you may want to play around with after modifying your tone, regardless of if you're using the highlights or you're using the exposure method, is to play around with your camera profile. This way you can give your image a bit more contrast and a bit more life really quickly. And if I'm holding down the J key on my keyboard, it's not adjusting those highlights within my sky, but it's giving the image a little bit more contrast and a little bit more brightness, and it's just adding life into the scene. Now again, regardless of method, you could also use your local adjustments to mask in that highlight recovery adjustment. So either way you choose, whether you're using the exposure way by reducing exposure, or you're reducing the highlight slider to recover those highlights, you can use your masking options and tools inside of Photo RAW to apply that adjustment into a specific area. The first way we talked about was using our masking brush, which we are just going to use a brush to do that. And again, the bracket keys on your keyboard are a quick way to increase or decrease the brush size. Left bracket will decrease the size and right bracket will increase the size. And we can again just use our masking brush to paint in that adjustment and recover those highlights within our scene there. Another way is to use your masking bug, which is essentially your gradient mask tool. We can just drop this down. We can use this smaller handle to rotate it if necessary. And this is with the adjustment applied. You can see it really helps to bring back the highlight detail within those clouds while again protecting our foreground section. And lastly, you can use your luminosity mask, which essentially will, by default, target the brightest areas in your image, which is what we want in this photograph, especially when we're trying to mask an adjustment into our true white areas. So if we turn on our luminosity mask, We'll view this. Remember, white reveals and black conceals. That white within our mask is mainly applied into those bright areas of the sky. Now again, if you don't want that applied to your foreground or different sections, you can always use your masking bug to remove that from specific areas of your scene. And I also forgot to mention this earlier, but it is also a way that you can modify your luminosity mask is you can actually brush different regions of your luminosity mask away if you need to. So if I reset this mask, I'll grab a luminosity mask. I can also just use my masking brush as well to remove this luminosity mask and the adjustment that it's applying from a specific area within my photo. So if I don't want it applied to the road, I could just mask this away from the road with my masking brush. And now it's only applied to the sky and the areas surrounding the road. And so now that we've modified our sky area here, one thing I would add also into this scene to bring a little bit more life into the foreground is I would actually use my Super Select AI tool. I can use that by just hitting K on my keyboard. I'm going to hover over this road section. I'm going to select that, and I'm just going to add a bit of detail with dynamic contrast. Now, depending on how much detail you want, you could either bring in surreal or soft is a really great one as well. If we choose soft there, it gives it a nice bit of detail, but it's not too intense and doesn't distract from the rest of the regions within the scene. Another thing I would do is I would grab all of the foliage and grass within my photo. I would right click and I would bring in a color enhancer filter to increase the color. That way I can have a bit more saturation into those areas of my photo. Again, just giving them a little bit more life. So within my color enhancer filter, because it's targeting the foliage within the image, let's just increase the saturation a little bit there to give it a little bit more color. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard to check out the original, we have the original and then after. And again, if the image is looking a little bit dull or flat, I'd recommend going into your Develop tab and playing around with these camera profiles. I may just go back into the effects and just pull back on the saturation a bit because I am using that vivid camera profile, which does enhance the color a bit. But as you can see, it doesn't take a whole lot to recover those blown out highlights and fix overexposed photographs inside of Photo RAW. It's incredibly easy to do, and it can make your images really look a lot more natural and appealing by going in and bringing back that detail into those blown out highlights.